Hi, my name is Ngawang Chimi.
I'm Christina.
I'm Julia.
I'm Ken.
Isn't
And I'm Martin.
And today we're going to be discussing sex trafficking. Our presentation will be outlined as followed. We will define sex trafficking and give you a better idea as to what it is, including common facts and misconceptions. We will explore the concept of the trafficker, including where this crime can happen, to whom it can happen to, and the phases of the manipulation process. Later, we will discuss sex trafficking from the victim's perspective, including risk factors, interventions, and prevention strategies to help to hopefully break the chain of sex trafficking. Finally, we will summarize our thoughts and conclude with an interactive game. Some expected learning outcomes from this presentation include being able to define sex trafficking, identify risk factors of sex trafficking in relation to an adolescent population, recognize potential victims based on warning signs, understand common misconceptions and facts, identify health promotion strategies that can help enhance the well-being of victims, list available resources for victims and families, and articulate the importance of this knowledge in our nursing practice. So what is sex trafficking? Sex trafficking is an act of recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining a person through the use of fraud, force, or coercion for compelled labor or commercial sex acts. Victims of human trafficking can be any age, race, sexual orientation, or socioeconomic level, and they can be from urban and rural areas. Sex trafficking has become a global health issue according to the World Health Organization. Just to differentiate, sex trafficking is a specific type of human trafficking. They differ because sex trafficking is specifically for the purpose of sexual exploitation. Some important facts regarding sex trafficking include 70% of victims are women and children. Sex trafficking is the fastest growing criminal global enterprise. 800,000 victims are globally trafficked each year, and over 2 million children trafficked will be sold on an average of 15 times per day. These facts are not a tactic to scare, but a means to inform you of how real and relevant sex trafficking is in day-to-day life. It's also important to understand some common misconceptions regarding this topic, because sex trafficking includes a lot of stereotypes as to who can be trafficked, where it happens, and who's at risk. Some common misconceptions include persons can only be foreign nationals or immigrants from other countries. This is incorrect because trafficked persons can be from anywhere and of any age. Victims reside everywhere, locally and internationally. Sex trafficking and human smuggling are the same thing. The difference is sex trafficking is a sex crime against a person, while human trafficking is a crime against a country's borders. Sex trafficking is only found in illegal underground industries. In reality, trafficking can occur within legal and illegal establishments. Common areas include restaurants, hotels, strip clubs, escort services, and the internet. All victims are under physical force and bondage. Yes, while physical form can be used, and it is used, the main form of abuse by traffickers is psychological because they target vulnerable victims. Victims will always try to seek help from the public. This is not always true because victims can be scared, ashamed, have a lack of trust, and be unwilling to get their trafficker in trouble due to fear of further abuse. Only women and children in poverty are at risk. While women and children make up a large percent of victims, males are also victims of sex trafficking. Traffickers do not discriminate based on gender, race, or socioeconomic status. Essentially, they will target anyone who is vulnerable and can turn a profit. Now we know what sex trafficking is and some common facts and misconceptions. Julia will elaborate further on where it's happening, to who it happens to, and who the traffickers are.
So, as Christina stated, sex trafficking is a global threat to society. Often people aren't aware that this crime is happening right under their noses. So where does it happen? Here in Canada, sex trafficking tends to happen in highly populated places such as major cities and frequently visited areas like tourist attractions. What I found to be shocking is a lot of the sales in Canada and advertisement of this crime are done on the internet, which can be hard for the justice system to track down. Internationally, most victims are picked up from Asia, in Thailand, Pakistan, China, India, and Bangladesh. Victims are sometimes even being sold by their own families due to poverty. These victims taken from Asia often end up in the US or Germany to be sold to wealthy clients and pimps. So how does sex trafficking happen and by whom? Unfortunately, victims may be trafficked by their own family members. This can be for money or drugs, and usually by parents with addiction problems or that already abuse their children verbally and/or physically. Victims also reported neglect from caregivers. In fact, 59% of trafficked adolescents reported a history of sexual and physical violence before the age of 15. 26% also reported assaults by their father or stepfather as the perpetrator. One of the most common perpetrators is a Romeo boyfriend or love interest. These men will lure adolescent girls and members of the LGBTQ community by coercion and manipulation. They will woo the adolescent with compliments and gifts until they have enough leverage to push them into sex trafficking. As mentioned previously, money can play a large part in getting adolescents into sex trafficking. These youths may already be homeless or involved in child protective services or the justice system. They become so desperate for money in a home that they are successfully lured by jobs advertised as requiring no experience and easy money, where they are unfortunately sex trafficked. Due to their lack of family, no one comes looking for them or notices changes in their lifestyle, so they become trapped in the hands of a sex trafficker. So there are 6 ways of manipulation sex traffickers often use to get people into trafficking. They may use one or even many of these techniques. To use luring, a stranger will approach an adolescent and appear very interested, say nice things, and show care and concern for them. Adolescents may meet this person online or through someone they know personally. In grooming, they will act like a very generous boyfriend or they will make the victim feel adored and spend money on them by buying things like intimates and jewelry. They may also encourage the victim to look older and more provocative and push them to indulge in risky behaviors such as using drugs, drinking, skipping school, and taking explicit photos. To use isolation, they will encourage the adolescents to distance from their friends and family. They will tell them their family and friends are toxic and that the trafficker boyfriend is the only person they need in their life. Using manipulation, the trafficker will ask the victims to do sexual things with them or others to repay them for all the money and care they've shown them. Traffickers will tell victims that the money they make doing these sexual favors will help them maintain their new lifestyle, earn money for their future, or repay someone they have a debt to. Threats will be used if the victim tries to leave the boyfriend or rejects offers to do sexual favors. The trafficker will threaten to expose things such as explicit photographs or videos of the sexual acts the victim has performed. They may also threaten to physically hurt the victim or someone they care about. Finally, in exploitation, the trafficker's goal is to control and exploit the victim by forcing them to have sex in exchange for things they need, want, or for money. We've identified risk factors across the victims that put them at risk for sex trafficking. Those risk factors are poor individual health practices and coping skills and low self-esteem. Next, Chimmy will expand further on one of those factors.
Thank you, Julia. So one of the risk factors is individual health and coping skills. Firstly, I would like to provide a brief description of it. Individual health refers to any action taken by them to prevent any type of diseases and promote self-care. Example would be washing your hands regularly, going for regular medical checkups, etc. Coping skills refers to how individuals deal with challenges and stress from their day-to-day lives. A positive example would be working out when you are stressed or anxious. So one of the risk factors for individual health practices and coping skills is adolescents with poor coping skills, usually rebellious adopted teens, are more likely to hang out with dangerous boyfriends who end up prostituting them. Adolescents in general believe in their uniqueness and sense of invincibility, causing them to often engage in risky behaviors like dating dangerous individuals. Sex traffickers often use emotional manipulations like buying gifts, telling them they're beautiful, etc., to lure them um, to lure their victims in a false sense of security, or use physical force to create a fear in the victim. Authorities often have trouble with these individuals in their refusal to cooperate, since they still believe that they are in relationship with their sex trafficker and do not want to create trouble for them or are too scared to report them. Adolescents with poor coping skills are also more likely to use drugs due to stress, anxiety, depression, loneliness, and may give sexual favors for money and drugs like marijuana, cocaine, or painkillers. These individuals are often easier targets for sex traffickers since they usually use their illegal drug habits and lack of financial stability as leverage. In order to promote self-care, individuals need to learn the early signs of a relationship being toxic and abusive so that they can get out before it's too late. In the age of social media, individuals should also be wary of strangers that compliment them, buy them gifts, since they could be potential sex traffickers. How does this affect the health of the individual? Adolescents in this day and age face a number of challenges in the school environment. Bullying, which includes online harassment, lack of friends, and social support, occur in every school environment and can cause adolescents affected to be angry, stressed, depressed, anxious, lonely, etc. Adolescents can use various types of coping skills to deal with these situations. Some can be poor coping skills like drug and alcohol abuse, which can physically and mentally affect adolescents. The brain goes through a lot of changes during adolescence period, creating new connections between synapses and destroying the ones that are not needed. Using drugs and marijuana can cause interference with the neurotransmitters and damage connections with the brain, causing loss of memory, inhibiting development of perceptual abilities. Studies also shown that adolescents that drink alcohol are also more likely to develop alcohol dependence later on. Aboriginals have suffered a lot in the past, from being re-educated in residential schools, where bullying, physical and sexual abuse was a norm from teachers and peers alike, to the Indian Act. Many used alcohol and drugs to deal with these struggles due to the lack of social service during those days, creating a sort of norm within the Aboriginal community. Adolescents from Aboriginal background are more likely to binge drink and compared to non-Aboriginal and are also more likely to use drugs like marijuana and other types of drugs. Drinking and drugs can create feuds and cause violence within the family, which can cause them to run away. Many who run away often have little financial stability and are likely to do illegal activities for survival, making them prime targets for sex traffickers since they're alone and have little social support. In October 2004, Amnesty International released the Stolen Sisters report, which shows that 2,329 women were murdered or missing all across Canada. From then, 829 were reported to be Aboriginal, meaning 28.4% were Aboriginal, even though Aboriginal make less than 5% of the total population of Canada. And more than half of these cases remain unsolved. How does it affect the significant other? Poor coping skills can significantly increase the risk for sex trafficking among adolescents. Alcohol and drug abuse can cause feuds and fights within the family, as I listed above. Due to this, coupled with their sense of invincibility, they often run away. Since they do not have any income or little social support due to drug habits, many often turn to illegal activities. These individuals are prime targets for traffickers, as I mentioned before, since they are involved in illegal activities and are trying to survive on their own and have less. This also creates less attention on the sex trafficker, since if these individuals go missing, no one would know. Now that we have identified one of the contributing factors that affect young adolescents, what can we do as nursing? Zinni will explore how we can use the Ottawa Charter to help us with this. Zinni?
Okay, thank you, Chimmy. I'll be providing the first nursing intervention needed to address the issue of sex trafficking with a rationale. As Julia had said earlier, the population at risk for sex trafficking includes adolescents who are in the social welfare system, those that have fallen through the social safety net program, which is like those that are going through foster care and those that are, going through the welfare system across the provinces. Even adolescents who have run away from their homes, those who are homeless, those who have had like negative experiences with the law enforcement agencies or even with child welfare agents. You also have those that are also transitioning from the welfare system into transitioning programs and those that are in the advocacy centers and in group homes. Now, our first intervention would be to develop personal skills, which is part of the health education part of the Ottawa Charter. So our first intervention is to provide and promote education regarding sex trafficking before the luring stage to these adolescents. We know the luring stage is the stage before anything starts to happen. So we need to meet them before this happens to them. So what we do at this point in time is to provide this education. The essence of this would be to enable this age group develop personal skills to help manage the changes that they're experiencing at that point in time, being psychological. And we know that if this is not handled properly, it would lead to this poor individual health practices and coping skills. Now, we can do this in collaboration with other specialty nurses like the psychiatric nurses who are very good at this sort of cases and work with the NGOs and the government as well. So how do we do this? First, we can start doing this by conducting sex trafficking awareness programs or what we call campaigns. And this will be targeted at adolescents in schools, as in areas where we find these adolescents, areas like the schools, the advocacy centers, group homes, residential homes, and also target the parents too as well. And what are we going to be doing during this campaigns? We'll be teaching these adolescents about sex trafficking, what it's all about, how to recognize the signs, or you can call it the onsets of a sex trafficking recruitment team, how to recognize, these pimps as these pimps, or you could call them the sex traffickers, when they come to meet them, what to do when they find themselves in this sort of situation, the dangers of sex trafficking, and then the various resources that are available to them as adolescents. And these resources, I would outline them in just a bit. And this program would also educate them, since we're in Ontario, is also to educate them about Ontario's anti-human trafficking strategy that has been provided by the government as well. And under this education part would also be educating even the schools themselves. They have policies on social trafficking and also for sex trafficking as well. And so we would educate the school personnel, the counselors, the nurses in those schools as well, the educators, and then we'll train them on noticing and on understanding the signs of sex trafficking among their students and strict compliance with this anti-trafficking protocols. Another thing to do is also to develop public education materials, and the purpose of this would be to entrench this education, to entrench this awareness into the adolescents, and this will be done by providing these materials which would be developed and the resources needed. And this will be, delivered by the mass media, the internet, all sorts, just to get every single adolescent to get their hands on them. And this will be done through other partnerships with different platforms that house adolescents as well. Research has also shown that adolescents listen to adolescents like themselves. Therefore, it will be one of the other ways we're also going to entrench education is to set up a youth teaching youth volunteer groups. And what this group will do is we're going to train youths, and then these youths will now train other youths on how to know the signs, red flags, and indicators of sex trafficking, how to report it, and how to spread the word on how to stop sex trafficking. It would also train other youths on how to become volunteers in NGOs that help against sex trafficking, and how to get other youths to stay informed. One other the very last one would be to create parenting programs, and this would actually be essential for those homes where the children run away from their homes because of the domestic environment that they find themselves, the kind of parents they find themselves, and how the parents are not able to cope with these changes that are going on with their children. So we're going to be teaching the parents on how to foster a better relationship with their children as they go through the same period. One other thing that should be done would be to provide counseling services and connect these adolescents with the other counseling services and resources that are available for them. In summary, I have provided the first nursing intervention, being education, and discussed how to promote this program. So as Julia mentioned earlier, we identified 2 factors that increase the risk of sex trafficking. Martin will now expand on the second risk. Martin?
Yes, thank you, Zinni. So far, we've identified poor coping skills as a factor that increases the risk of sex trafficking in young adolescents, and the implementation of health education initiatives as an intervention that addresses this. Another risk common amongst young adolescents that we found to increase their risk of sex trafficking is low self-esteem. To have low self-esteem is to have a poor subjective evaluation of one's self-worth. This is reflected in individuals who feel bad about themselves or hard on themselves or generally think they're not good enough. These sentiments are common amongst the majority of young adolescents aged 11 to 20. But how does low self-esteem actually develop? As young adolescents transition from childhood to adulthood, they go through major changes. As these changes develop through early, middle, and late adolescence, so does their self-esteem. Rapid physical development and the appearance of secondary sex characteristics caused by puberty can lower an individual's self-esteem, especially if they are developing early or later than their peers. This may be in part due to imaginary audience, which is an adolescent feeling that one is at the center of everyone's attention. Cognitively, during this time, adolescents will attempt to develop and establish their own set of personal values, which will be challenged and debated in their social environment. This can have an effect on self-esteem because challenging someone's values can feel like a personal criticism. This may be in part due to adolescent egocentrism, which is an adolescent cognitive developmental stage that is characterized by a heightened sense of self-consciousness. Psychosocial development also plays a role in self-esteem development. At this time, adolescents are heavily influenced by their peers' opinions, especially those of the opposite sex. They're trying to learn how to engage with other people in a social context, explore their sexuality, and form stable relationships with people other than their immediate family. Limited growth and development of any of these identities can have a negative effect on self-esteem, which can have a profound impact on their health. Low self-esteem can make the development of social and romantic relationships difficult. A study on happiness identified strong social relationships as a contributing factor for overall satisfaction. A lack of this can lead to loneliness, which can impact a young individual's mental health. Feelings of not being good enough lead to a poor body image. This dissatisfaction will bring feelings of unhappiness, and while occasionally feelings of unhappiness are common with most people, consistent feelings can lead to depressive tendencies, which have an effect on both mental and physical health. Low motivation stemming from low self-esteem can affect an individual's physical health through a lack of activity and professional aspirations. It's because they don't feel that they are capable of succeeding, so they don't even bother making an attempt in the first place. Drug experimentation is normal for most young adolescents. As they gain independence, they often rebel in the form of substance indulgence. Drug use in a social environment can be common, but when abused as a coping mechanism due to their low self-esteem, it can have negative effects on the individual's health. Marijuana, for example, can cause anxiety, and alcohol causes extreme liver damage. These can also lead to harder substances like cocaine, crack, and heroin, all of which are highly addictive and can potentially kill you. Low self-esteem can also indirectly affect the family and significant others of the individual as well. Since family normally acts as a social support network, these feelings of negativity leave the support with a sense of helplessness because they can't alleviate these feelings for someone they care about. This inability to help only increases the isolation of the individual from their significant others and family. Now that we've established how low self-esteem affects an individual and their significant others, how does it increase the risk of sex trafficking? An adolescent with low self-esteem is especially susceptible to compliments and luring tactics from the traffickers during the initial luring phase of sex trafficking. This is because the adolescent is still heavily reliant on outside factors that establish their own identity. If they don't think they're attractive and want to be viewed as such, they'll likely respond to another person's flattery with acceptance in an attempt to satisfy that image of desire and raise their self-esteem. An adolescent with low self-esteem is more likely to stay during the exploitation, which is when the trafficker uses violence and threats to establish control over their victim. This is because at this point, the trafficker becomes the only source of emotional and physical support. This works to lower an already fragile self-image and leaves the victim feeling like they have no other options of support, even though that's not necessarily. We've now identified low self-esteem as a factor that makes young adolescents vulnerable to sex trafficking. Azine addressed a preventative intervention, but low self-esteem affects targets before and after they've been trafficked. Diane will expand on what nurses can do to address low self-esteem in these individuals. Diane?
Thank you, Martin. So I'm going to introduce the nursing intervention, which to identify the victims of sex trafficking in the clinical base. As Martin said, low self-esteem may get adolescents into troubles. With low self-esteem, they are not able to adopt and maintain and build new social networks. May fail to fulfill their basic human need to belong. So traffickers take disadvantage of these victims to recruit adolescents into the chain of sex trafficking. In many cases of trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation, trafficked person may develop trauma bonds with their traffickers and may not view themselves as victims. So it is hard for both public and nurses to identify the victims of sex trafficking due to the intimacy and kinship between traffickers and victims. For example, boyfriend and girlfriend, even parents and their children. For adolescents, I would like to indicate that self-blame links closely to self-esteem. Trapped persons may engage in self-blaming attitudes and blame themselves for being duped into a situation beyond their control. So in this case, victims may miss their opportunities seeking for help and rescue. According to the research, 50 to 80% of trapped individuals are seen by a healthcare provider while under the control of their trafficker. Nurses are usually the first caregivers interact with patients, and we need to understand it is still possible to identify the victims of sex trafficking if we pay enough attention to the red flags and asking rightful questions. So we can use focused questions like, have you been threatened if you try to leave your job? Have you been physically harmed in any way? What is it like where you work? Where do you sleep and eat? Do you sleep in a bed or on the floor? Have you ever been deprived of food, water, sleep, or medical care? Has anyone threatened your family? Have your identification paper been taken from you? Is anyone forcing you to do something you don't want to do? Let's have a look at indicators of trafficking and in short, red flags. So the first, the person accompanied with the patient may take control of the answering questions or trying to stop patient to answer the question by themselves. The second, the patient looks frightened when we ask the question. The third, the patient may have tattoo or branding symptoms on themselves. It could be a name or just a vocabulary such as daddy. The third, the patient may be not allowed to hold their own identification documentation like password, birth certificate, or stuff. And the last, the patient may experience the physical injury such as bruises or fracture. Most of the time, delay seeking for the treatment. So during the assessment, establishing trust is very important as the time is short. The nurse should interview the patient in private to promote honest, open answers. Additionally, using empathy and reflective listening to encourage victims to disclose their stories. Also, there are skills here. For example, do not call boyfriend a trafficker, and simply tell the victims it is not your fault. Last but not least, the nurses can use government documentation, law enforcement to gain the trust of the victims. In Canada, victims of trafficking are not required to testify against their trafficker to gain temporary or permanent resident status. Talking about the rationale, traffickers only bring victims in for major injury to minimize risk of discovery and time of work. So successful identification during this real visit saves the client and break the chains of trafficking. Okay, so I'm passing the topic to Martin for the conclusion.
Thank you, Chimmy. We've now identified poor skills. We've now identified poor coping skills and low self-esteem as the largest risk factors to sex trafficking of young adolescents. We've also identified sex trafficking awareness advocacy and victim identification programs as possible nursing interventions that address these risks. You should be able to define sex trafficking and differentiate the term from human trafficking and human smuggling. You should also be aware by now of how sex trafficking happens and the methodology for victimization. I will pass it on to Christina to list off some available resources.
Thank you, Martin. If you know someone who may be a potential victim of sex trafficking, point them, their friends, or their family members to Covenant House Toronto or Shared Life for more information and support. We will now be testing your knowledge and listening skills with a learning activity. I'll pass it on to Julia.
Okay, so for our matching activity, we're going to ask you to match the way of manipulation with what the sex trafficker is saying. So unfortunately, our effects couldn't transfer onto this platform, so just pretend the answers aren't there yet. Wow, your profile is amazing. Do you model? Are you interested in becoming one? I can help you. We should schedule a meeting. Yes, Martin?
Is it luring?
That's correct. Have you tried cocaine? It's amazing. I have some with me now. Try it. Yes, Zinni?
I think that should be grooming.
That's correct.
Thank you.
You shouldn't talk to your friends anymore. They're toxic. I'm the only one who really cares about you. Christina?
Is it isolation?
That's correct. You need to see 10 more clients tonight unless you want me to break your face. You want to eat too, right? Go earn it. Martin?
I believe that's isolation, Julia.
No.
Oh, exploitation?
That's correct.
Yes, I see.
Go on a date with him for me. You need to repay me for all the clothes and jewelry I bought you, and we need the money for our future together. Zinni?
I'm thinking that's absolutely manipulation.
That's correct. If you don't do this, I'm going to post our sex videos online, or I'll kill your entire family. Martin?
Threats, Julia. That's a threat.
That is correct. So now I'm going to hand it over to someone else to talk about the importance of this knowledge in nursing.
Yeah, I'll take that, Julia. So, why is this important? We just spent the last 40 minutes talking about all this knowledge on sex trafficking. What is the importance of this knowledge on the nursing practice? Victims cope with their situation by telling themselves that they deserve it or that it's their own fault. They might also convince themselves that they're in control of the situation and that they aren't actually victims. It is unlikely that an individual in this situation will seek help for themselves. It is therefore a nurse's responsibility to gain a victim's trust and offer opportunities to improve their health that they don't see are there. 50 to 80% of all sex trafficking victims have been treated at a clinic without a nurse's knowledge. We as nurses may be the only contact a victim will ever have outside the chain of sex trafficking. So it makes this information crucial to a victim's identification, client behavior, and on nursing practice in general. Thank you for listening to our presentation. At this point, we'd like to address any questions any of the audience members may have.